At the end of World War II, there was a need across Europe to bring those remaining members of Hitler's government and inner circle to justice for the crimes of the conflict. Millions had been slaughtered in a war of Hitler's making, and men such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop were brought to the Nuremberg Trials. These were the most senior post-war trials that brought action against the members of Hitler's government, and there were a number of men, 11 in particular, who were sentenced to death. Only 10 death sentences would be carried out by the infamously botching executioner John C. Woods, whose credentials have been called into question throughout the decades. Those who were not sent crashing through the American gallows within Nuremberg prison's gymnasium on the 16th of October 1946 were either acquitted of their charges, or they were given a prison sentence of varying length. In this video we look at those Nuremberg Nazis who escaped the hangman's noose. This is a story of clever defence lawyers, men close to Hitler whose bones would not be discovered until decades later, and death before the hangman could perform his job. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. There were 4 charges for the Nuremberg defendants to be accused of. Some were accused of all 4, and others were accused of a few of them. The first defendant who we will look at was actually tried in absentia, meaning he was not present in the courtroom, and that was Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary. Bormann's disappearance and subsequent discovery of his remains years later in Berlin are somewhat incredibly controversial and debatable, but he was tried by the Nuremberg courtroom as if he was sat in the dock with the rest of the defendants. He was given a death sentence, meaning that if he had ever been discovered by the Allies, then they would have hanged him as a war criminal. But whatever you believe about what happened to Bormann, he would escape the hangman's noose. Some believed he died in Berlin in the final days of the war, others believed that he got away to South America. Karl Dönitz was the Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine, and the man who briefly became the President of the Reich following Hitler's death. He was convicted of carrying out unrestricted submarine warfare, breaching an earlier naval treaty. However, his defence lawyers were cunning, and managed to prove that the Americans had also committed the breach of the Second London Naval Treaty themselves. With this he was found guilty of 2 charges, planning and initiating a war of aggression and participating in war crimes. Dönitz, because of his skillful defence, was given 10 years imprisonment for his efforts during the war, and he was locked up in Spandau prison until the 1st of October 1956. He actually lived another 24 years after this, dying in 1980. One man who many believe should not have been brought to the Nuremberg trials was Hans Frischer. Compared to men such as Hermann Göring, he was a nobody, and he was a popular radio broadcaster within Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Frischer was acquitted of the 3 charges he was accused of at Nuremberg, but the Soviets would later bring him to a denazification court separately, where he was sentenced to 9 years hard labour, and he served 3 of these. He was someone who had made a career because he sounded similar to Goebbels over the radio, and he broadcast anti-Allied sentiment during the war. Walter Funk was Hitler's Minister of Economics, and he was also one of the lesser-known defendants. He was also the president of the Reichsbank, and he helped to finance the Second World War. He was actually considered and labelled by the courtroom as a banker of gold teeth, and he admitted to being morally guilty of crimes against those who were being persecuted, as his bank processed huge amounts of wealth stolen from people who were slaughtered in the concentration camps. Even their hair was taken to be used. Funk at Nuremberg was visibly distressed, and cried as evidence was shown throughout the courtroom, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment within Spandau, and he was released in May 1957 on grounds of ill health. Probably the most recognisable defendant was Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal, and the commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring was the second highest ranked member of the Nazi Party, and for many years the designated successor of Hitler, until he was sacked and fell from favour after attempting to negotiate peace with the Allies. Göring was one of those defendants who was charged with all 4 of the crimes of the courtroom, and he was sentenced to death. However, on the night before his execution, he actually cheated the hangman and consumed a cyanide capsule that he had somehow concealed upon his person for some time, or had kept this inside of his cell. Rudolf Hess was also recognisable. He was the Deputy Führer, Hitler's number 2, until he made his ill-fated alleged peace mission to Scotland. Hess had been imprisoned for some time because of this, from 1941 until the end of the war. In fact, he would never be a free man following his flight. He was found innocent of 2 charges, including crimes against humanity, as much of the Holocaust had been carried out when he was actually in the custody of the British. His failed flight was what saved him from the hangman, and he remained inside of Spandau prison until his death there in 1987. Gustav Krupp von Berlin und Halbach was a rather unique defendant at the Nuremberg Trials. He was selected to be indicted in error, instead of his son Alfred, who actually ran Krupp, the huge German industrial powerhouse that made weapons, tanks, planes, and anything used by the military. Gustav Krupp was declared unfit for trial, as he was actually partially paralysed, but the charges remained on his record if he ever recovered, and he died in 1950. Robert Ley, the stuttering head of the DAF, the German Labour Front, held many positions inside of Nazi Germany, but there is a possible argument that exists that he should never have been brought to trial. Following an accident during the First World War involving his aircraft, he had developed a severe stammer and was known for incredible mood swings. Ley was a war criminal, there was no doubt about it, but he escaped his fate on the gallows, dying by his own hand inside of his prison cell. After his death, his brain was actually analysed, and it was found that he had very severe lesions on his brain, probably caused by his earlier accident, and that technically this would have rendered him classed as disabled, meaning he may not have stood trial at all. Konstantin von Neurath was the Minister of Foreign Affairs before the Second World War broke out, and was replaced by Joachim von Ribbentrop. He was actually found guilty of all 4 of the charges, but he had been placed on furlough by Hitler since 1941, and he resigned 2 years later because he argued with the Führer. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was released in 1954 after he suffered a heart attack. Franz von Papen was the pre-Nazi Chancellor of Germany and the Vice-Chancellor under Hitler in 1933. He held a number of ambassadorial roles inside of the Nazi government, and was not actually charged as a war criminal at Nuremberg, and he was acquitted. But in 1947 he was tried by a denazification court, and was sentenced to 8 years hard labour, which was reduced. Erich Raeder was the Grand Admiral and the Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. He retired in 1943, and he was found guilty of all charges that he was accused of, however was sentenced to life imprisonment. He, like Dönitz, had argued about the other Allied nations committing the same sort of crimes that he was accused of. It was found that he did oversee executions, and had given permission for some Allied commandos to be shot. Dr. Hjalmar Schacht was one of the lesser-known Nuremberg Nazis. He was an economist and the pre-war president of the Reichsbank, and was the economics minister who violated the Treaty of Versailles. He increased the German military spending. He was acquitted of all charges, but some have claimed that the British may have acquitted him to safeguard a number of other German industrialists and their interests with regards to them. Some claim that he was not a ruffian and was actually a man of character, and Schacht had actually been imprisoned inside a concentration camp by the Nazis, and was horrified that he was brought to trial as a war criminal. The head of the Hitler Youth, Baldur von Schirach, was found guilty of the final charge of crimes against humanity. Under his watch for many years, he had converted young boys to become future soldiers who fought for Hitler and the Reich. He did, unlike so many defendants, actually express some form of repentance for his crimes and for the actions of the Nazi Party and for what he had done. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison and was released in 1966. His wife actually during the war had stood up to Hitler and challenged him when she heard about the Holocaust. Now the most infamous man who escaped the hangman's gallows was Hitler's close friend, architect and Minister of Armaments Albert Speer. Speer was someone who inside of the courtroom apologised for the crimes of the party, and he carefully selected his words as to not implicate himself further. He would be responsible for the use of slave labour inside the armaments production factories. He shockingly even said that he had considered assassinating Hitler inside one of his bunkers by gassing him through the air vents, which attracted a lot of laughter and humour amongst his fellow defendants. But Speer somehow managed to convince one judge to spare him, and by the skin of his teeth, 4 judges to 3, he was spared death. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, but in the years after, he tried to make himself a reputation for being a good Nazi. Evidence has been later found that he even signed off on the construction of further gas chambers and crematoria within Auschwitz, and dispatched some of his men to report on the progress. If this information had been found, Speer's character would have almost been blown to pieces, and he would have most certainly been sentenced to death. So these were the men who managed to escape the hangman's noose. Some of them should probably have been sent crashing through the trapdoor, or they escaped their fate like Göring hours before the executions were due to take place. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.